In this lesson, we'll learn how we can use the command line to render our scenes outside of Maya. So using the command line to render our Maya scenes outside of Maya is something that can actually be very, very useful. One good instance in which we could use this would be if we had a scene that was very, very intensive, very heavy, and the process of opening up that type of a scene within Maya and then actually trying to render it could cause Maya to crash because you're using resources to actually open the scene here within the viewport and using additional resources to render that scene out. Now, in this situation, this is obviously not a very good example of that because the scene is obviously not very heavy. But one of the other opportunities that we get by using command line is the fact that we can actually render multiple Maya scenes in a sequential order. And I'll elaborate a little bit more on that here in just a moment. But for now, let's take a look at how we can use the command line to render out a scene like this. Now, there's a few things that we may want to check on before we actually try to use the command line to render this out. First, what we have to do is make sure that we have a few things set within the output settings. First of all, we do want to make sure that we have things like our output resolution set to what we want. And also we want to make sure that we have something like the frame number and extension set to the correct value if we're going to actually render out some sort of a sequence. So having this set will make sure that we are actually outputting these in the correct format, whether you need these in a name number extension or name extension number. Just make sure you set that in your Maya scene before you actually render. Okay, now everything else we're going to leave blank and we'll show how we can actually set these options within the command line flags. So once we have these set, we can just simply save our scene. And then if we want to, we can actually close Maya from this point because from this point forward, we actually won't be needing to rely at all on Maya's user interface. Now when it comes to actually using the command line, we could just simply open up a DOS prompt and type in the appropriate commands. But one method that I actually prefer to use is to make some kind of an executable batch file. This will just make the process a little bit easier. So as far as where we create this executable file, it really doesn't matter. In my case, I'm just going to drop it into the current Maya project that I'm working out of. So let's just simply right-click, go to New, and we'll create a new text document. And we can just call this something like command line render. There we go, and we'll give this a new extension. We'll give it a .bat extension, and it asks if we want to change it. Go ahead and click yes. Now that we have this created, all we have to do is now input the correct data. So from here, all we'd have to do is just simply right-click and edit this document. Now, just to save a little bit of time, I've gone ahead and just typed out the appropriate command, so that way we don't actually have to go through the process of typing this out. But what we will do is just discuss some of these different render flags that are responsible for this. And you can see really this is just one continuous line of commands. Now just to make this a little bit easier for you to see, I'm going to go ahead and just turn on my word wrap function here within Notepad. That way we can make sure we get the entire command in here. So as you can see that there are quite a few commands that are responsible, and this is really just a small portion of the total number of commands that we have within the command line render. But let's just break down a few of these and take a look at some of the more common ones. The first thing that you want to do is make sure that your command line render starts with this command called render. This is what is actually going to call up the batch render and start this process. The first flag that we have is this -r. So this is determining which rendering engine we're going to use. And in this case, we're going to render using MentalRay, which is the MR flag. Now, if you're going to be rendering using Maya software, we could just simply switch this from -mr to SW, which is Maya software. Now, one of the commands that I actually prefer to use is the command called file. Now, what this will do is actually read into the Maya file and render each pass as it sees appropriate. So this is something that can be really useful if you have multiple render layers within your Maya scene. You may have some layers that you want to be rendered with MentalRay. You may have other layers that you want to have rendered with Maya. And using this file flag, it will render each layer according to what you have set within your Maya scene. So next to this, we have the render directory. Now this is determining where the output images will be placed. And in my case, I'm setting the render directory to this particular Maya project file. Now, what you want to do is make sure that you don't have any sort of spaces within your actual directory. Because if there's any sort of a space, the command prompt or the command line render will find that or see that as a new command. So if you're rendering out to some kind of a directory that has a space in the name, you want to make absolutely certain that you have these quotation marks around your entire path. That way the command line will read this as one continuous line. Now after this we have the flag for IM, which is the image name output. So in this case we're going to output an image with the name command line. So the command line will then have some sort of an extension at the end of it, whether it's .tga, .bmp, whatever that extension is that you define will be placed at the end of this particular file. Right after that we have this little sequence of commands. This is for the start and end frames if you have some sort of an animated sequence. So -s is the start frame, and we have a start frame of 1. -e is the end frame, and in our case we've defined the end frame as just frame 6. Now after this we have the -of, which is the output format, and in this case we've determined that this is going to be a TGA file or a targa. So once we render, we'll have a file that is command line.tga. Alright, and then finally we have the actual path to the Maya file that we want to render. Again, if you're using some kind of a path that has a space in the name, you do want to make sure that you have some kind of a quote covering this entire path. And then a lot of times, as a matter of personal preference, I like to insert this pause command at the end of my executable batch file. That way, if we are trying to render this using the command line, and if we have some sort of a render error, if we were to just simply render this out, the error would pop up, and then your batch render window would really disappear before you had a chance to see what the render is. By inserting this pause command, we can make sure that the window stays up, and it really gives us a better opportunity to determine what is actually causing the render error, if there is one. Alright, now a lot of this that we've had a chance to talk about, the render directory, the image, start and end frame, output format, this is really commands that you would want to use if you're using something different than what we have set up in our Maya scene. You'll notice that by default, the Maya output path will match whatever we currently have set up in our project. So you can see we already have within the scene file Maya rendering tips, images, what the file output name is going to be, start and end frame, format, so on and so forth. We can set all of this within the Maya scene and then actually just have the command line look at that. So again, these commands would really only be used if you want to output to something different than what we have set up in our Maya project or in our current Maya scene. If you really just want to use whatever we have currently set up in our Maya scene, there's really no need for these. So for a lot of my particular scenes, really all that I have to have is these commands. Render, what we want the render engine to be, and then the actual path to the file itself that we actually want to render. For a lot of situations, this will suffice for the command line render. Now, what really makes something like this useful is the fact that we can actually queue up several Maya scenes within this command line and render them all sequentially. So if you were going to be gone from your computer overnight, or maybe even for the entire weekend, and you had several Maya scenes that you wanted to render and just let them just kind of render out one by one, we can actually set up multiple files within our scene. So in our case, obviously, we would set a path to a different file. Here, this would be a path to a different file, and so on and so forth. And then as soon as the command line is finished rendering with the first file, it'll then move on and do the second file, and so on and so forth until we hit the end of our queue. So really this is very, very useful, not just for rendering complex scenes, but for being able to render multiple scenes in a sequence. Now, in my case, I'm going to go ahead and put this longer command back that we had in here. Again, we can just insert this pause command. Once we have this all set up and typed out the way that we want, we can just go to File and then save this image, or save this particular file out. Once we're finished with that, now we can just go back and find the actual file that we typed up. And with that, all we have to do is just double click and start this command line render. So you can see this will now pop open a DOS prompt, and here we go. So you can see now the rendering process is beginning, Final Gather is starting, and it'll just now sequentially go through and do each and every frame. And once the rendering is completed, you can see that, again, because we had this pause command assigned at the very end of our command, that it will now pause and then wait for us to take some kind of action. Again, if we're trying to find some kind of an error that may have occurred, this gives us a really good opportunity to go back and scroll through and try to find any sort of cause that may have caused this. Once we're finished, though, we can just press any key, and that will now stop the command line. And again, now because of these commands that we had defined within the command line render, it has now overridden the settings that we had defined in our Maya scene file. And now if we take a look at the images directory, here's our command line renders. So here's the entire sequence. And if we were to just open this up in FCheck, you can see here's our sequence that was rendered out. Alright, so that's a look at how we can use this command line render as a way of overriding and getting a very high level of control over our final rendered images.